I don't know why I went to that damned lake that day. It's one of those things that happens without thinking, like when you open a door, and halfway through you realize you didn't really mean to open it. I'd been hearing about Crystal Lake for years, the way people would talk about it like some sort of secret place. They'd say the best fishing in the state, they'd say. The ice is thick enough to skate on for weeks, they'd claim. But it wasn't just the fishing that caught my attention. It was the way they would say it, like it was the last place you'd want to be, like they were whispering to you, daring you to go. I didn't listen to those whispers. I packed up my gear, drove my truck out to the lake in the middle of January, and set up at the same spot I'd heard about from a buddy who used to work out there. It was a late afternoon, the sky already bruising with the promise of snow. The ice was solid beneath my boots, creaking now and then like an old house settling. The kind of sound that makes you wonder if it's going to hold up. But I didn't care about that. I didn't care about the warnings people had given me. I didn't care about the old man in the diner who, when I asked for directions, looked at me with something between pity and fear. "Ain't nobody goes there no more," he'd said, "not since it happened." But it wasn't the first time I'd heard that. There was always some story, some half-told thing about a bad fish, a drowning, a strange reflection. I drilled my hole into the ice with the same kind of confidence I always had, set up the seat, lowered the line, and settled in for the wait. My breath came in steady plumes of mist, the smell of the lake filling my nose, the cold, damp scent of water trapped under a layer of frozen glass. At first, it felt peaceful, almost tranquil. The only sound was the scraping of my ice auger and the wind tugging at the branches of the trees nearby. But that peace didn't last long. I don't know what exactly made me look down into the hole. I wasn't expecting much, just a few hours of boredom, maybe a little catch and release. But then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow beneath the ice, dark and fleeting, like a fish darting too quickly for my eyes to follow. But then it moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if something was circling beneath the ice. I leaned over the hole, squinting into the darkness. My heartbeat picked up a little, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. It was there again. But it wasn't a fish. It was something else. It was the shape of a man, or what could have been one, moving beneath the ice, its limbs twisting and jerking with an unnatural kind of fluidity. The body was contorted in a way that made my stomach turn. I couldn't see the face. Thank God I couldn't. But I could see its arms. Long, unnaturally long, reaching for the hole. For a second, I didn't move. My mind screamed at me to stand up, to walk away. But I couldn't. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, watching this thing mimic my movements beneath the ice. Every shift of my body, every twitch of my fingers, it copied. Except it was wrong. Its limbs bent in ways no human body should. It wasn't just copying my movements, it was stretching them, twisting them into something grotesque. I pulled my arm back from the hole, and it did the same. I moved my head, and so did it, tilting as I did. And then slowly, painfully, it reached toward me again, dragging its fingers across the ice. I snapped out of it then. I jumped up, knocking my fishing pole to the side. The ice beneath me cracked as I scrambled backward, my boots slipping against the frozen surface. My pulse raced as I stared at the hole. The thing, whatever it was still there, still mimicking my every movement. But now, it wasn't just imitating. It was learning. I grabbed my things as fast as I could, dragging my gear away from the hole, but the thing didn't stop. It moved faster now, its movements erratic but purposeful. It wasn't just copying me anymore. It was watching me. It was learning how to do more than what I could do. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. My heart hammered in my chest as I heard the ice behind me groan, the sound of cracking reverberating underfoot. I could feel it. Its eyes on me, though I never saw its face. I ran, I tripped, I fell, but I didn't stop. It wasn't until I reached the truck that I dared look back. And when I did, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The hole I had drilled was no longer empty. The ice beneath it had shattered, the jagged cracks sprawling out like broken glass. But what terrified me the most was the reflection. It wasn't just my face staring back at me. The thing, the one that had been beneath the ice, was there too, its twisted, elongated body now hovering just under the surface. And it was smiling. I don't know how long I sat in my truck, hands shaking, staring at that spot on the ice. The storm had rolled in, the wind howling through the trees, and yet I couldn't leave. Something was wrong with that lake. Something was wrong with what lay beneath it. I didn't go back the next day, or the next, but I can still feel it, still hear it, the scraping of ice against ice, the mockery of my every movement. And every time I close my eyes, I see that reflection, twisted and waiting. I stood up, my legs shaky, as the hair on the back of my neck stood up. "That's not funny, guys," I said, but my voice came out wrong, strained. Tom was the first to move. He grabbed his rod and started reeling it in, as if doing something, anything could make the sound stop. But it didn't. The laugh continued, getting louder, like something was approaching from far away. I glanced at the hole Tom had drilled earlier, and I swear I saw something move underneath the ice. Then, Mark was gone. 1 minute he was standing by the fire, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. And the next, he was gone. His coat, his boots, everything was left behind, but he was nowhere to be found. The others scrambled to their feet, yelling his name, but there was no answer. The wind picked up, the air turning sharp and bitter as if it were mocking us too. The hole, the one Tom had drilled, was wider now, bigger than it should have been, and beneath it, just visible in the dim light, something moved. Something large. And when I leaned forward to get a better look, I saw it. Mark's face. His eyes were wide open, staring up from the blackness below. His mouth was open, as though he was still laughing, still trapped beneath the ice. We never found him. The storm came in harder after that, and we didn't stick around. We packed up, left the shelter standing, and drove back to town as fast as we could. The image of Mark's face frozen beneath that hole burned into my mind. I don't know what happened to him, but I know this. There's something beneath that ice. Something that waits. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just a bunch of guys, a few cold beers, and the frozen expanse of Maple Lake. The kind of thing you do when winter drags on and you're too bored to sit around the house anymore. We'd done it before, many times, but this time was different. It wasn't the cold or the wind, but something that I can't explain. Something that started the moment we drilled that first hole into the ice. There were 4 of us: Tom, Kyle, Mark, and me. We hauled the gear out to the middle of the lake, the snow crunching under our boots, the weight of the equipment making the walk feel longer than it should have. It was one of those gray, bitterly cold mornings where the sky seemed to stretch forever, blank and empty. The air was thin and biting, and I remember pulling my scarf up over my nose, trying to keep warm. We set up the portable shelter, a small, battered tent-like thing that shielded us from the wind, and cracked open the first beers of the day. Mark and Kyle were already getting their rods set up, talking about the big fish they were going to catch, while Tom fiddled with the auger, readying another hole for the lake to swallow our bait. At first, everything was fine. The day slipped by in a kind of peaceful rhythm. We fished, joked, drank, and fell into the easy camaraderie that only happens when you're away from the world, surrounded by nothing but white and cold and your friends. There's something about ice fishing that makes everything feel simpler, like the world is frozen in place, and you can just let it happen without having to rush. You settle into the stillness, and for a while, it's enough. But then, a few hours in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense of wrongness that crept in around the edges. At first, I chalked it up to the cold. The wind had picked up, and I noticed that the snow wasn't falling quite right. It swirled around us in erratic gusts, kicking up little flurries that didn't seem natural. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow, as if it was holding its breath. Tom noticed it first. He was standing by one of the holes, staring down at the water with a look I can't quite place. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear, but I'll never forget that expression. He was holding the ice auger in his hand, his eyes wide like he'd just seen something move beneath the surface. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice thin with something I couldn't quite identify. "See what?" Kyle asked, still messing with his bait. I don't know. Something down there. Tom pointed at the hole, but I didn't see anything. The ice was thick, the water dark and still. I swear, he said, taking a step back. There was something down there. Something big. At that point, none of us really thought much of it. We laughed it off, told Tom he was seeing things, maybe too much beer in his system, but he couldn't shake it. He kept glancing over at that hole, his eyes darting down into the blackness, his brow furrowed in confusion. I started to feel it too, the strange sensation of being watched, though I didn't want to admit it. It was too late in the day. The light was fading, and the wind had turned cold and biting. Around sunset, things took a strange turn. Mark, who had been doing most of the talking up until then, suddenly fell silent. He was staring out toward the center of the lake, his face pale. At first, we thought it was just the cold getting to him. But when he didn't respond to Tom's jab about catching a monster fish, we all turned to look. What is it, Mark? I asked, my voice a little more tense than I meant it to be. He didn't answer at first, just kept staring out over the ice. Then he turned his head toward us, and there was a strange look in his eyes. I don't know if it was fear or something else, something darker, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice shaking. We all went quiet then, straining to listen. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees at the far edge of the lake, but there was something else. A faint sound, distant at first but growing louder. A laugh. It was soft at first, just a whisper over the wind, but then it became clearer. It echoed across the frozen surface of the lake, high-pitched and almost mocking. The laugh bounced off the ice, reverberating like a cruel joke. None of us laughed. The air in the shelter grew thick, like something had changed. The laugh seemed to come from all directions, swirling in the wind, and it didn't stop. It just kept going, stretching on, growing louder and louder. It had been years since I'd set foot on Crystal Lake. More than 20, in fact. Too long, if you ask me, considering how much it haunted my thoughts. Every winter I'd see the place in my dreams, a deep, frozen stillness where the ice stretched for miles and the wind howled its eternal warning. The lake, the one from my childhood, the one I left behind. I'd always intended to return, but life never quite let me. Until that winter, when the memories felt like they might smother me. It wasn't much of a reunion. The small town I grew up in had been swallowed up by time, and nothing much was left except the old rickety gas station and a few worn-down shops with prices that had been stuck in the 70s. Crystal Lake itself wasn't any better. It looked as dead as I remembered. The trees around it were skeletal, their branches clawing at a bleak gray sky. The lake itself, frozen solid, just like in my dreams, was a barren expanse of white, silent, and forbidding. But something drew me there, some pull that was stronger than fear. I walked along the edge of the ice, each step heavier than the last, as if the weight of the years was sinking me deeper into the earth. I tried not to think about the boy I saw that summer, the one who drowned, the one whose ghost had whispered my name every night since. But the memories flooded back all the same. It had been a hot day when it happened. I remember the sun beating down on my skin, the laughter of my friends ringing in my ears as I stood on the shore, watching the others swim. There were kids everywhere, laughing, shouting, diving in and out of the water like nothing could touch them. But then there was the boy. He was on the far side of the lake, his dark hair slicked back, his face pale against the sun. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew something was wrong. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. He looked at me like he was calling me, like I was the only one who could help him. I never saw him again. They said he'd drowned, that he'd gone under and never come up. I remember the search, the frantic voices, the orange life vests being pulled from the water, and the moment when they told us. He was gone. But that wasn't the end of it. No, it had only just begun. I kept hearing his voice, soft at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind calling my name. At night, the sound would fill the room, and I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It wasn't a nightmare. It was something else, something worse. A presence. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it was always there. The first time I saw him again was years later, in the dead of winter. in a dream. He was standing on the ice, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, and he was calling to me, begging me to help him. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but the ice cracked beneath his feet, and he fell into the water, sinking into the darkness. And then I woke up. But here I was standing on the frozen shore of Crystal Lake, facing the place where it had all happened. The boy's voice was still in my ears, and this time I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to face whatever it was that had been following me for all these years. I stepped closer to the edge of the ice, my boots crunching in the snow. The surface was smooth and undisturbed, but as I moved closer, I saw something beneath the ice. A shadow, faint at first, but then clearer. His face. The boy. He was there, trapped in the ice, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. He was calling my name, just like he had in my dreams, his voice muffled but unmistakable. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The boy's face stared up at me, his features distorted, his body frozen beneath the ice. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was something worse, something that had been waiting all these years. The ice beneath my feet creaked. I took a step back and then another, my mind racing. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have come. But it was too late to turn back. The boy's face pressed closer to the surface, his eyes following me, pleading, desperate. The crack came suddenly, sharp and loud. The ice beneath my feet split wide open, and I stumbled back, my heart stopping in my chest. The boy's face was gone, swallowed up by the darkness beneath the ice. But the sound didn't stop. It was like something was trying to break free. The ground trembled. The ice cracked again, and the air turned cold enough to burn. I heard the boy's voice in my head, louder now as if he were standing right next to me. Help me. It was a scream, a howl, and it tore through me like a living thing. I turned to run, but the ice was no longer solid. It buckled beneath me and I fell, my arms flailing as I tried to catch myself. I landed hard on my knees, the cold seeping into my skin, and when I looked up, I saw it. The boy wasn't gone. He was standing in front of me, his body twisted, his eyes empty and hollow. He was frozen in place, but he was here. He was waiting for me. Help me. His voice filled my mind again, and I reached out, but it was too late. The ice cracked beneath him, and he was gone, swallowed by the lake. And I was left, kneeling in the snow, surrounded by silence. I don't know how long I sat there. I don't know how I got back to the car, or how I drove back to town. But I do know this. Crystal Lake isn't just a lake. It's a place where something terrible happened, and the boy, his spirit, still waits beneath the ice, calling for someone to rescue him. And I know, deep down, that I'll never be free of him. He'll always be there waiting for me to return. And one day I will. It started like everything in this town with the festival. You know the kind. The sort of thing they throw together to help people survive the long, bitter winters. The streets would be lined with booths selling chili and hot cocoa, the smell of fresh-baked pies wafting through the crisp air. A parade of ugly sweaters would march down Main Street, and the whole town would gather at Crystal Lake to watch the ice sculpting contest. I hadn't missed a single one of those damn festivals. They were an excuse to drink too much, to pretend we weren't stuck in the middle of nowhere, scraping by in a town that lived on the edge of obscurity. But the 15th annual Winter Festival was different. It was different because something went wrong, and we've been paying for it ever since. It was the night of the big ice skating relay, the highlight of the festival. People were crowded at the edge of the lake, bundled up in thick coats and scarves, shouting and laughing like nothing could touch them. The ice looked like glass, smooth and perfect, a sheet of shimmering white beneath the moon. I was out there too, sitting by the bonfire, enjoying my beer, feeling that numb warmth settle in as the cold gnawed at the edges of my bones. I've never been one for skating, but it was always fun to watch. That's when the crack happened. It wasn't a sound you could ignore. It was loud, like a whip cracking against the air, only sharper. The whole lake seemed to tremble. People stopped talking. The air itself seemed to freeze, every breath hanging for just a moment. I looked up, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. Nothing except the crack that echoed on, until it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then the ice split. Not just a crack here and there. The whole surface splintered, a jagged line that ran across the lake like a wound. People screamed, stumbling backward, their eyes wide with terror. Some tried to run, others just stared, paralyzed, as the ice split further, the crack expanding outward. And that was when it happened, when everything went to hell. A gust of wind, unnatural, like it had been waiting for the right moment, swept across the lake. The air turned colder, biting like needles, and the split in the ice widened. But it wasn't the wind that made it worse. It was what happened next. The ice froze faster, much faster than it had any right to. It started spreading out, covering the whole lake in seconds. The water below froze solid, as if something had flipped a switch. One by one, people started to drop, slipping onto the ice, their feet frozen to the ground as if they had been stuck in place. They screamed, their voices echoing over the stillness, but nothing happened. The ice kept spreading. It wasn't like any ordinary freeze. It was as if time itself had started to freeze, like it was going backwards or forwards or sideways. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt it too. My own body was stiff, slow, like I couldn't quite move, like the world had become a giant clock that had stopped ticking. I tried to run, but my feet were glued to the ice. The cold was crawling up my legs, seeping into my skin, my bones. And then I saw it. The thing that made me understand that none of us would be leaving that night. In the middle of the lake, where the ice had split open, a shape rose from the frozen water. It wasn't a person, at least not like we are. It was like a shadow, a dark mass of shifting ice and cold. It didn't have a face, not really, but I could feel its eyes on me, could feel its presence in my chest, cold and suffocating. It was watching, waiting, and I knew, deep down, that it was the thing responsible for this, for the freezing of time. And that's when it happened. The world snapped back into place, like a rubber band stretched too far and then released. The ice stopped spreading. The cold let go. People stumbled to their feet, but something had changed. They weren't just standing there. They were staring, blankly, not looking at me, not looking at anything really. They just stared. I looked around, at the people who had been my friends, at the kids and their parents all standing frozen, like they were caught in some sort of trance. But when I turned to look back at the shape on the ice, it was gone. The cold had lifted, but the shadow remained in the air, a heavy presence that clung to the fog. I don't know when I realized it, but the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. We were stuck, trapped. The festival wasn't over. We were still there, in that moment. The whole town was still caught in that frozen instant, unable to escape. That night lasted for what felt like forever. We all went back to the bonfire, sat in the same places, made the same conversation, as if nothing had happened. But it had, and I knew it. We were reliving it. Every time I blinked, the moment reset, and I was back at the lake again, watching that crack, feeling the cold seep into my bones. At first, I tried to fight it. I ran, screamed, tried to break the cycle, but nothing worked. I couldn't escape. No one could. Time was frozen, and we were stuck in it. Then, just when I thought I was going to lose my mind, something strange happened. The shape appeared again. It didn't rise from the ice this time. It was already there, standing at the edge of the lake, its presence like a weight that pressed on my chest. It didn't speak, didn't move, but somehow, I knew what it wanted. It wanted us to stay in that loop, trapped forever. I don't know how it happened, how I broke the curse, but I did. The next time it reset, I did what I hadn't done before. I looked straight at the shadow and said, "No." It wasn't easy, but the word broke the silence. And when I did, the shadow faded. The ice cracked open and splintered, and the town was freed. Or so I thought. I woke up the next day, the sun shining too brightly through my window. But when I stepped outside, everything was wrong. The street was quiet, but I felt it in my gut. I looked toward Crystal Lake, and sure enough, I saw the same scene unfold in front of me. The festival, the people, the ice. It was happening again. I ran. I ran as far and as fast as I could, but I knew that I wasn't free. The town wasn't free. We were all still caught in that nightmarish loop, waiting for someone to break the curse. And somehow, I think, I'm the one who's supposed to do it. I should have listened to the warnings. But then I've never been the type to listen. Not to the locals, not to the weather reports, not to anyone who tries to tell me what to do. So when I found myself on that remote frozen lake at the edge of town, I wasn't thinking about the old stories they whispered at the diner. Stories about people who went out there and never came back. I was just thinking about getting a good photograph and a little solitude before heading back to my life. I had been hiking for a few hours far off the beaten path, deep in the woods where the trees were thick and the air smelled like old pine and cold earth. The lake lay ahead, an untouched sheet of ice that stretched out like a vast desert of white. There were no footprints, no sign of life, only the soft hiss of the wind across the frozen surface. The sky above was clear. Too clear, really. The kind of clarity that chills you to the bone and makes you feel small, insignificant. The lake sat still and quiet, its dark, glassy surface almost mocking the vibrant blue of the sky above. I had heard the rumors, of course. How could I not? It's a small town, and in a small town, people talk. They said the lake had been cursed, that something had been trapped beneath the ice long ago. Old folk tales about a creature, or maybe a spirit, that waited for someone to wander too far from the shore. The stories varied, but they all had one thing in common. The ice was not your friend. The lake was never just a lake. I dismissed it. Folklore, ghost stories, superstitions, they were all the same to me. The older folks had their ways and I had mine. I didn't come all this way to listen to ghost stories. I came to experience the silence, the peace, the kind of solitude that only a place like this could offer. So, I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and made my way to the ice, feeling the crunch of the snow beneath my boots. The air grew colder as I stepped onto the frozen lake. The snow here was thick and soft, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. My boots sank in deeper than I expected, but I pressed on, feeling the weight of the world fall away with each step. I don't know how long I walked out there, maybe an hour or so, but as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the world shifted. The wind picked up, the temperature dropped, and a strange feeling washed over me, a feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I stopped. There was nothing around me but the vast white expanse, the wind, and the icy silence. But then, just as I began to think I'd imagined it, I heard it, a faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, the way it howled and sighed through the trees. But the more I listened, the more distinct it became. The whisper wasn't from the wind. It was something else, something deeper, something ancient. It was a voice, barely audible, but there. I strained to hear it, but it was too soft, too fleeting. The words were jumbled, indistinct, but I could swear I heard my name. Derek. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who was out here with me? I spun around, expecting to see someone, maybe another hiker, maybe a fisherman who had wandered too far from the shore. But there was no one. No footprints, no signs of life, just the endless white of the frozen lake. I took a few steps backward, my eyes darting around, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The whispers came again, clearer this time, a low, rattling sound beneath the ice, like something, or someone, scraping against it. I turned and began walking back toward the shore, my steps quickening. But the closer I got, the louder the whispers became. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices, growing clearer with each passing moment. I could hear them now, rising and falling like a chorus, as if 1,000 voices were trapped beneath the ice, speaking to me, begging me to listen. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat. The ice beneath my feet began to crack, hairline fractures spreading out from where I stood. I could feel it, the weight of something pressing against the surface, pushing from below. The ice groaned, a low, unsettling sound that made my skin crawl. My pulse raced as I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the frozen surface. The whispers were now a constant, a low murmur that seemed to come from all directions. I could feel them pulling at me, calling me toward the center of the lake. I turned to run, my legs moving faster than my brain could process. But as I did, something shifted beneath me. The ice cracked wide open, the sound of it splitting through the air like a gunshot. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest as the darkness beneath the ice shifted. Something large, something ancient was stirring beneath the surface. I could see it now, just barely. A shape darker than the water moving slowly, deliberately. It was massive, like a shadow rising from the depths. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. It wasn't human and it wasn't animal. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to get away, but my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ice. The whispers became louder, more urgent, pulling at my mind, drawing me closer to the crack in the ice. I felt the cold creeping up my legs, numbing my skin, and then, suddenly, the voices stopped. Everything stopped. The world fell silent again, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined the whole thing. But as I looked down, I saw the ice beneath me had shifted, cracked wider. The water below was black, like the bottomless depths of a well, and I could hear something moving in it. A shape, shifting and changing, rising toward me. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. I couldn't understand them, but I didn't need to. I knew what they wanted. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the shore, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged and wild. The lake lay still behind me, its surface smooth once again, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew it was there, beneath the ice, waiting. I don't go out there anymore. Not to the lake, not to that place. The whispers still follow me in my dreams, just out of reach, like something I can't quite escape, something beneath the ice, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far.